This I'll probably leave this. I'll relink this stuff probably. Okay, so it'll work. And then there'll be another one up here. And it's gonna come to you as an email as well. I'm gonna give you directions. I'm gonna give you directions. All right. I have to change all the links and stuff like that. The whole stupid everything I set up is not now. It thinks it's a different class, so it's going to get confused if you try and access it. Question? All righty. So, I mean, I asked this question before, but honestly, I never got the answer I wanted. So, what the hell is this stupid class? What does statistics mean? Analysis and interpretation of data? Close. You're missing one part. What do you have to do before you analyze and interpret it? You actually have to collect it or get it. That's correct, right? So the thing is the first thing you really need to do is collect the data. Does anybody know the word for that? What the word is that we use? Sampling is correct. That's called sampling. Does that make sense? So then we say we collect n, let's say data points. N is the thing we recall as the sample size. Does that make sense? Then what do you do? Then usually you're going to calculate something. Does that make sense? Might not be that serious of a calculation. It might just be like, oh, who had the most money? Does that make sense? That's important, right? That's a statistic. Does that make sense? So then we calculate something, right? Usually I always ask everybody, what's the difference between statistics and a statistic? So when you calculate something based off of the sample data, that's called a statistic. So you calculate a statistic. Does that make sense? So if we go in here and I start asking everybody how much money they have in their wallet, right? And you're like, yo, why are you asking me how much? No, but I ask everybody how much money they have in their wallet, calculate, get some data. Does that make sense? And then we go and I say, what was the most someone ended up having? Does that make sense? That's a statistic. Does that make sense? It's a calculation based off the data set. Is that right? The average, the lowest amount. These are all statistics. Does that make sense? The percentage of people that have $12 or more. Anything. Does that make sense? Does that make sense, guys? All right. You calculate something. So after you calculate something, then what did you say we do then? What did you say we did? We have to analyze and interpret or draw a conclusion. Does that make sense? So then we're gonna analyze and really interpret, and then we do all of this to hopefully draw some sort of conclusion. Right? Does that make sense? This whole thing is statistics. Does that make sense what I'm saying? The calculation is the statistic, right? But statistics is all this crap. All right? And the thing that people usually mess up the most, that's the worst part. It's the worst part if you mess it up, because then the whole thing's a waste of time. You might as well not have done it. All right? Does anybody know what I'm talking about with that? Can you give me an example? How do you mess up sampling? Go ahead. Okay, well that's not recording the things correctly, right? If I don't record the data points correctly, yeah, that's going to be a big problem. Does that make sense? But that's kind of dumb. Not what your suggestion is, but that'd be dumb if that's what I did. I mean, anybody can make a mistake at any time. You know what I'm saying? So that's not, you're right though. It's not incorrect. All right. But but there's a bigger problem sometimes. That's like harder to see sometimes. That like a lot of times I usually liken it to like what people do when they're being racist. And another thing here is that, believe it or not, the only way really to prove someone is being racist is statistics. Most of the time I find though that people look at it the exact opposite. People turn around and start saying, hey, they put me in the lower class. Why are they saying I'm like that? The statistic is racist. No, the statistic is not racist. The person doing the statistics might be racist. The person interpreting the statistics might be racist, right? But the only damn way I'm going to prove that someone is actually being racist is to show that they acted the wrong way over and over and over and over again when they should have been acting the right way. Does that make sense? Right? So then if normally, let's say you're supposed to go left, right? 50% of the time, but now all of a sudden you go left 75% of the time because you don't want to go right for some reason, right? We can clearly show that the person has a bias. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? So statistics, actually, one of the main things we're going to talk about in this class as we go through the entire thing is how we compare groups. Comparison of groups is kind of really important because that's going to be able to show you if someone was treating somebody incorrectly. Does that make sense? Does that make sense what I'm saying? So I don't think you probably thought that that might be something we could do with this stuff, but I find it's kind of interesting that we can actually do stuff. All right. So, oh, another thing, like somebody asked me before, you were asking, what were you asking about? I can't remember. No, you were, that's funny. But you were asking me about, I'll think of it, don't worry about it. But this entire process is statistics. Then the thing is it's like, well, I just mentioned, hey, sometimes we can do the sampling thing incorrectly, right? So there's something that we refer to as a population. These are like all possible results. All right, I'm just labeling a bunch of things here: X, X1, X2, X3, X4, X5, X6. The only reason why I'm labeling in this way is because I have no idea what we're going to start collecting. Does that make sense? We might be collecting how much money you have. We might be collecting how many pairs of shoes you got. We might be collecting your race. We might be collecting how many total people there are. We might be collecting, God knows, your car, right? What type of car you have. If you have a car or not. You have a bike. You don't have a bike. I don't know. You know what I mean? How you get to work each day. Does that make sense? Like so many things people will want to collect for whatever reason, right? What country your parents are from. How many times, if you've ever left the United States, like I don't know what we're looking at. Does that make sense? All right. So these things might be numbers, they might be letters, they might be names, they might be God knows what. Does that make sense? All right. Population is all the possible results. Does that make sense? All right. So let's say I want to determine how much people usually bring to class when they take statistics. Okay. In terms of money in their pocket. Does that make sense? But wait a second. You take statistics in Africa. You can take statistics in here, right? You can take statistics in California. You can take statistics Japan. God knows what, right? All these people, all these differences. Is that correct? If we're going to do this properly and we want to see what the average amount of money that people bring to class, we're going to have to literally find every single person that's ever been to a statistics class, ask them how much money they brought that day, right? You're going to come next week. I really kind of need to know how much money you're going to bring next week also, right? Which we can't figure out, right? Right? And then what we're going to do is we're going to take all these numbers and we're going to find the average. We're going to add them all up. We're going to divide by how many there are. Is that correct? But I can't even collect all of them, right? So what am I going to end up doing? They say sample, okay? But not only sample, we say we do a random sample, okay? What do I mean by random sample? What does that mean to you? What does it mean if you randomly sample things? You're somehow randomly picking things, right? But what does that mean? That means that any one individual thing can't have a better chance of being selected than anything else. Does that make sense? So a random sample just means every data point has the same chance to be included. Does that make sense? So when I was in statistics, when I was in high school, I remember the teacher said, hey, you got to go do a survey. After you do the survey, you're going to analyze some stuff. You know, you have to report the data to this project or whatever, right? So all the kids went to the mall. At the time, people used to go to the mall. Nobody goes to the mall anymore. But you go to the mall, and there used to be all these people in the mall all day long, and then they're walking past you, and they make them fill out the survey. Does that make sense? Well, my friend, when he went to the mall, I'm like, I'm not going to the mall and do this shit. I'm like, I'll ask people in class to get this thing over with right now, right? He's like, I'm gonna go to the mall. Well, all right. You want to come with me? No. Bunch of people go with him. He goes to the mall. He comes back with the data. Somehow, every single person he asked was a girl. Sounds a little biased, is correct. Because he figured when he went to the mall, he wasn't going to randomly select people. He was just going to pick the girls because maybe you get a date, right? This is not a joke. This is legitimately what he did, right? He even said it. He's like, I'm going to just ask girls. I'm not going to ask the guys. What's the point? You're definitely introducing bias at that point. Is that right? You're not randomly selecting anything. Does that make sense? Just like I can't just ask my friends. I can't just ask the people close by me. Is that correct? Right? I can't just ask the people I'm not scared of. Is that right? It doesn't matter. I got to ask everybody. Like that's the whole point of the thing. We need to figure out what the hell's going on. Is that right? So you're going to go and you're going to end up randomly selecting some things. Does that make sense? Then these things are taken over here, and then this is really what we're calling our sample. Does that make sense? So this is some random subset of the overall population. Does that make sense? All right, now, how many people are going to vote for Donald Trump in the election? You don't have to tell me, all right? Just think about it in your head. You see what I'm saying? Whether you're going to vote or not, all right? What if I told you that we randomly selected students and we determined that 100% of the students ended up saying that they were going to vote for Donald Trump in the election? What would your response be? What's your response? I said I go randomly select 50 people. All 50 people actually turned around and said that they're going to vote for Donald Trump. What's your response? Sorry? Well, I randomly selected them. They actually were random. Is that possible that that could occur? Certainly. That's definitely possible. Is that right? I don't care what you think, what she thinks, what he thinks. You could randomly select 50 people, and sure as hell, they definitely could end up saying that they're going to vote for Donald Trump. Is that correct? It's unlikely if you were to randomly select them. Is that correct? All right. All right, 50 people, fine, whatever. What if I select 5,000 people? What if I select 50,000 people? What if I select 5 million people? Fine, 50 people, it's possible. 5 million people, still possible, but really freaking hard to happen. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Right? The point that I'm trying to make is like you have no idea what you're going to end up getting in this sample. We're randomly selecting these things. We can't sit here and be like, oh, he said he's going to vote for Donald Trump. I'm not counting. No, the data is the data. Does that make sense? Right? We're collecting it, and then we have to see what it means. Does that make sense? Does that understand? All right. So a sample could have all kinds of crazy results. All right. There's a true answer that we're actually trying to determine, though. So let's say I was trying to determine the overall average of the population. All right. All right. So we take the average. We were talking about the amount of money people bring to a statistics class. Is that correct? All around the world, all time, right? There is an average. Does that make sense? I don't know what it is. I can't figure it out. I'm never going to be able to figure it out, but there is an average. Does that make sense? That is what we call this thing here. This Greek letter I'm writing here. It looks like an M sort of, but it also sort of looks like a U. Does that make sense? It's called mu. All right. It's like average. People usually say mean, right? This is the Greek letter M. This is what they used to use a long time ago. We still use it. Does that make sense? That's the average for the entire population. Does that make sense? We call that a parameter. All right. Easy way to remember this is just to say that when you have population, it starts with P. Parameter also starts with P. Does that make sense? Parameters come from the population. Statistics, as we said previously, come from the sample. Does that make sense? When I'm talking about the average, the name we give for the statistic for the average, we write this symbol, X, and then a bar, because all of these things are X's here. The bar means take the average of them. Does that make sense? X bar, though, is really just the same average of this crap. Mu is the average of all of this stuff. Does that make sense? You want these two values to be the same. You want to say, hey, I sampled a bunch of people, and then the number is representative of the overall population. The statistic. Does that make sense? But that's not always going to be the case. I just gave you examples where, I mean, I'm positive right now that there's no way that when we have the election, that there's 100% of the people are going to vote for Donald Trump. It's never going to happen. There's never been an election where 100% of people voted for anybody. Does that make sense? So it's not going to be 100% of people vote for Donald Trump. But my sample of 50 people, all 100 people ended up voting for Donald Trump, right? That means the X bar was like 100%. Does that make sense? But the mu is not actually 100%. Is that correct? The idea behind statistics is as n increases, the statistic should better approximate the parameter. Does that make sense? You couldn't have an election otherwise. Like when you have an election, do they know what you voted? Does your vote even count? Sometimes. In Florida, if electoral votes go to a particular candidate and I voted for the other candidate, my vote doesn't really count. Does that make sense? All right. I mean, it sort of did, but at the end of the day, it didn't. Does that make sense? By the way, I strongly recommend you vote. Okay, because otherwise you're not really part of this country. But the thing is if this didn't work, we couldn't do elections either. Does that make sense? The idea is that eventually we start asking everybody, right? Or as many people as we can. Then we get the best answer we can for what people think the new leader should be. Is that right? But in reality, you're really getting a biased sample. A lot of people don't vote. And they're coming from the same groups of people. Does everybody understand what I'm saying? They're not getting representation. Does everybody understand what I'm saying? all right? But if you kept asking more and more and more people, eventually you could possibly ask everybody. Is that right? If you did, you would get the right answer. So as n increases, the statistic would always better approximate the population. Does that make sense? Population parameter. Does everyone understand? All right. You should be able to see a announcement from me. All right. And I will give you some instructions on what to do. All right, but it's going to be pretty much the same thing as what we were doing. You're just going to click course materials. You're going to see the code on there. The only thing that's going to be different is you're going to click the next thing, and it's actually going to work when you plug it in. Okay? I'll give you links. I'll show you. You're not going to have to go to the bookstore. It should be sent to you by email. You too. E-text is just what they call the online textbook. Yeah. It's better than the regular one because you could search. And then it has videos in there. You click something and it pulls up video, and then it pulls up an example and stuff like that. It's better, trust me. All I recommend is just make sure you take notes. No, I can tell.